Tonight, we're covering the rise of one of the darkest regimes in modern history, the transformation of Germany into a Nazi state. From the aftermath of World War I to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the collapse of democracy, this is a story of crisis, propaganda, and the terrifying consequences of unchecked power. It's a lesson in how fear and hatred can reshape a nation and the world. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now let's dive into this chilling and important chapter of history, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. The story of how Germany descended into Nazism begins not in the 1930s, but in the ashes of World War I. In 1918, after more than 4 years of brutal trench warfare, massive casualties, and national exhaustion, the German Empire, once one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe, collapsed almost overnight. By autumn of that year, Germany was losing the war. Its allies were surrendering. The German military, stretched thin and demoralized, could no longer hold back the advancing Allied forces. At home, people were starving. The British naval blockade had cut off essential supplies, and the economy was in ruins. Cities were racked by strikes, protests, and mutinies. Discontent turned to rage. In November 1918, as revolution erupted in major cities, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Just like that, the centuries-old monarchy was over. Germany became a republic, declared from a balcony in Berlin by Philipp Scheidmann, a social democrat. But it was a republic born in crisis, with no roadmap and no national consensus. What followed was known as the Weimar Republic, named after the city where the new constitution was drafted. On paper, it was a bold democratic experiment. Germany had never known true democracy, and now, almost overnight, it had universal suffrage, a parliament, and a president. But democracy arrived not as a victory, but as a humiliating necessity, forced by defeat and internal collapse. The end of the war did not bring peace. Instead, Germany was plunged into chaos. In the streets, radical political factions battled for control. On one side were communists, inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917, eager to establish a Soviet-style government. On the other were paramilitary groups like the Freikorps, right-wing ex-soldiers who saw themselves as defenders of order, nationalism, and German honor. In early 1919, the new Weimar government crushed a communist uprising in Berlin with Freikorps support. The violence was brutal. Leaders like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered. This moment marked the beginning of a deep division in German politics, one that would never heal. Meanwhile, at the Palace of Versailles in France, world leaders gathered to write the peace terms. Germany was not invited to the negotiations. When the Treaty of Versailles was presented in June 1919, Germans were stunned. The terms were far harsher than expected. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, the infamous war guilt clause. It had to disarm, give up territory, and pay massive reparations. The treaty was seen not as a peace but as a punishment. Across the political spectrum, Germans called it a Diktat, a dictated peace. National pride was shattered. The military was humiliated. Millions of citizens saw their government as weak, dishonored, and complicit in national disgrace. The seeds of resentment were planted deeply. In this fragile, embittered republic, conspiracies and extremism began to flourish. Many Germans refused to believe they had truly lost the war. Instead, a myth took hold, the stab in the back legend. It claimed that Germany's military had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by internal enemies, especially Jews, socialists, and liberals. This lie would echo through the coming years, becoming a central theme in far-right ideology. The Weimar Republic, barely born, was already struggling to survive. Economic turmoil, political violence, and national shame consumed the country. And in the shadows, bitter veterans, radical agitators, and nationalist ideologues waited for their moment to strike. One of them, a former corporal and failed artist from Austria, had just joined a fringe group in Munich. His name was Adolf Hitler. In the chaotic aftermath of World War I, Germany became fertile ground for radical ideologies. The collapse of the monarchy, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and the constant political violence left many Germans angry, confused, and desperate for meaning. From this discontent, extremist movements began to take root, none more consequential than a small, unknown group in Munich calling itself the German Workers' Party. In September 1919, Adolf Hitler, a 30-year-old former soldier with no formal education or political experience, attended a meeting of the party as an informant for the army. He had been assigned to report on radical groups in Bavaria. But something unexpected happened. During the meeting, Hitler stood up and gave an impromptu speech criticizing a proposal for Bavarian independence. His passion and oratorical skill caught the attention of the group's founders. Just days later, they invited him to join. Hitler accepted, becoming member number 555, though the numbers were inflated to make the party seem larger than it really was. He quickly became the party's most visible and vocal figure. In 1920, the group changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. Hitler helped draft the party's 25-point platform, which included anti-Semitism, rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, national rebirth, and a call for a strong, authoritarian government. What the Nazis lacked in size, they made up for in energy and anger. They attracted ex-soldiers, nationalists, anti-communists, and the disillusioned middle class, people who felt abandoned by the political establishment. Hitler began giving fiery speeches in beer halls, drawing crowds with his emotional appeals to German pride and his scathing denunciations of Jews, Marxists, and the Weimar Republic. In 1921, Hitler took control of the Nazi Party and created his own private militia, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. These stormtroopers disrupted rival political meetings, intimidated opponents, and acted as the muscle behind the movement. Political violence in Germany was already common, but the SA escalated it into organized street warfare. At the same time, Germany's economy was sliding into disaster. By 1923, hyperinflation had reached catastrophic levels. The value of the German mark collapsed. Prices doubled almost daily. People carried wheelbarrows of money to buy bread. Life savings became worthless. The middle class, the foundation of any stable society, was being destroyed in real time. Desperation gave Hitler an opportunity. Inspired by Mussolini's march on Rome, he decided to launch a coup. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and 600 stormtroopers stormed a beer hall in Munich where Bavarian officials were gathered. He fired his pistol into the air and declared a national revolution. The next day, he led 2,000 men in a march through the city. But the coup, later known as the Beer Hall Putsch, failed. Police opened fire, killing 16 Nazis and arresting Hitler. He was tried for treason in early 1924. Yet the trial gave him a national platform. Over the course of weeks, he turned the courtroom into a stage, blaming Germany's problems on traitors, Jews, and the Weimar politicians who had surrendered at Versailles. The judges, sympathetic to his nationalist message, gave him a lenient sentence, 5 years in prison. He served only 9 months. During his time in Landsberg prison, Hitler began dictating a book to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess. The book, called Mein Kampf, combined autobiography with a toxic political manifesto. In it, Hitler laid out his belief in racial hierarchy, German destiny, and the need for Lebensraum, living space for Germans in the East. The Nazi Party had been temporarily crushed. But Hitler had planted the seeds of something much more dangerous, a movement with a name, a symbol, and a leader. And Germany had not seen the last of him. After the failed Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 and his brief imprisonment, Adolf Hitler emerged a changed man. He now believed that seizing power by force was too risky. The lesson of the putsch was clear. If he wanted to take over Germany, he would have to do it legally, through the system he claimed to despise. That meant elections, propaganda, and above all, patience. But for the time being, Germany seemed to be moving away from the kind of chaos that had empowered the Nazis in the first place. Under the leadership of moderate politicians like Gustav Stresemann, the Weimar Republic entered a period of relative stability and recovery. Economic reforms helped end hyperinflation. Foreign loans, especially from the United States through the Dawes Plan, began to rebuild industry and infrastructure. Cities flourished. Culture thrived. The worst of the post-war crisis seemed to be over. In 1925, the war hero Paul von Hindenburg, a conservative but respected figure, was elected president of Germany. Though he had little love for democracy, his presence gave legitimacy to the Weimar government in the eyes of many nationalists. Meanwhile, Germany was allowed to join the League of Nations in 1926, signaling a return to the international community. But this apparent success masked deep divisions and unresolved resentments. Millions of Germans still viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a national disgrace. War reparations continued to burden the economy. Many on the political right blamed socialists, liberals, and Jews for Germany's defeat and humiliation. Though the economy improved, unemployment remained high in some areas, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The Nazi Party, banned after the putsch, was reformed in 1925. Hitler, now banned from public speaking in several German states, focused on reorganizing the party structure. He created a hierarchical network with himself at the top as Führer, or leader. The Nazi message was fine-tuned to emphasize German nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism, all wrapped in promises to restore pride, unity, and strength. Although the Nazis remained a fringe movement during this period, they weren't alone in their extremism. Germany's politics had polarized. On the left, communists were gaining support among the working class. On the right, nationalist and paramilitary groups continued to spread conspiracy theories and incite street violence. The Center Party struggled to hold the Republic together. Hitler and his followers understood that they needed more than rhetoric. They needed discipline, image, and outreach. In 1926, the Nazi Party held its first Nuremberg rally, a grandiose event designed to show strength and unity. The swastika flag, the raised arm salute, and militarized pageantry became tools of propaganda. The Nazi newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, published a constant stream of nationalist and anti-Semitic content, shaping public opinion one headline at a time. Still, in national elections, the Nazis remained marginal. In 1928, they received less than 3% of the vote. Germany, it seemed, was not ready to embrace Hitler's vision. But Hitler was playing the long game. He watched and waited. He understood that his moment would come not when things were getting better, but when they got worse again. And worse they would get. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, sending shockwaves across the world. Germany, heavily dependent on American loans and investment, was especially vulnerable. Banks collapsed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. The era of Weimar recovery was over. And in the ruins of the second economic disaster in a decade, Adolf Hitler saw his second chance. When the Wall Street crash hit in October 1929, few in Germany grasped just how devastating its impact would be. But within months, the economic ripple became a tidal wave. American banks and investors, facing crisis at home, called in their loans from abroad. Germany, which had relied heavily on U.S. credit to recover from World War I, suddenly found itself gasping for air. Businesses shuttered. Banks failed. Unemployment skyrocketed, rising from under 2 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. Nearly a third of the workforce was without a job. Families lost their savings, homes, and hope. Soup kitchens and street protests became everyday scenes in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The brief window of stability under the Weimar Republic had slammed shut. The political consequences were immediate. Confidence in moderate parties eroded as the population turned toward extremes, both left and right. Communists promised a revolution that would abolish poverty and capitalism. The Nazis, meanwhile, offered something very different, a rebirth. They spoke not of class war but of national unity, strength, and revenge. They promised to make Germany great again. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party knew their moment had arrived. Using mass rallies, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and striking visuals, swastikas, uniforms, banners, the Nazis launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history. Their message was simple but powerful. Germany had been betrayed, weakened, and humiliated by foreign powers, greedy bankers, and internal enemies, especially Jews, Marxists, and corrupt Weimar politicians. Only the Nazis, they claimed, could restore honor and stability. The SA, Sturmabteilung, or brown shirts, ramped up street presence. They patrolled neighborhoods, broke up communist meetings, and clashed with political opponents in bloody confrontations. To many Germans, the SA seemed like the only force capable of restoring order amid the chaos. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazis surged from obscurity to win 107 seats, becoming the second largest party in the German parliament. It was a stunning rise, but only the beginning. Behind the scenes, Hitler cultivated relationships with powerful industrialists, military officers, and conservative politicians. He promised to crush communism, protect property rights, and uphold traditional German values. To many elites, Hitler appeared dangerous, but also useful. They believed they could control him, channeling his popularity to stabilize the Republic on their terms. In 1932, Germany held a presidential election. Hitler ran against the aging national icon, Paul von Hindenburg. Hitler campaigned with energy and charisma, flying across the country in a private plane, a first in German politics. Though he lost the election, coming in second, he had now become a national figure. That same year, economic misery deepened. The fragile coalition government collapsed. The Nazis, now flush with donations and energy, launched another electoral push. In the July 1932 Reichstag elections, they won 230 seats, becoming the largest party in parliament. But victory brought new problems. Despite their popularity, the Nazis lacked a clear majority. Hitler demanded the chancellorship, but President Hindenburg, still skeptical, refused. He called Hitler a Bohemian corporal, and instead appointed Franz von Papen, a conservative aristocrat, as chancellor. It was a disaster. Papen had no support in parliament. Government after government collapsed. In November 1932, new elections were held. The Nazis lost some ground but still held the most seats. The Republic was paralyzed. People were desperate. Behind closed doors, political schemers looked for a solution, any solution, to end the chaos. And finally, on January 30, 1933, a fateful compromise was made. Under pressure from conservatives who believed they could keep him in check, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The Weimar Republic was over. And the Nazi era had begun. On the morning of January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was officially appointed Chancellor of Germany. Outside the presidential palace in Berlin, a small group of Nazi supporters cheered, carrying torches and swastika flags. Most Germans, however, were unsure what to make of the appointment. Some were indifferent. Some were anxious. Few could imagine just how quickly their country was about to change. Behind the scenes, conservatives believed they had finally found a solution to Germany's political crisis. President Paul von Hindenburg, elderly and increasingly frail, had agreed to appoint Hitler under pressure from advisors like Franz von Papen, who famously claimed, "We've hired him." The idea was simple. Hitler could mobilize the masses, but the conservatives would hold the reins. They thought they could control him. They were wrong. Hitler moved with stunning speed. He knew he had only limited constitutional power as chancellor. The Nazis controlled key ministries, the interior, for example, but not the full government. If he was to create the authoritarian state he had envisioned, he would need a crisis. And one arrived within weeks. On February 27, 1933, fire engulfed the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament. Flames lit up the Berlin sky. Police arrested a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, at the scene. Whether he acted alone or was framed remains debated to this day. But the Nazis wasted no time blaming the entire Communist Party. The next day, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. This emergency measure suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. It allowed the government to arrest and detain opponents without trial, censor publications, and invade privacy. Thousands of communists, socialists, and critics were rounded up. The streets of Germany grew quiet and fearful. With the left silenced and the media under Nazi control, Hitler pushed for the next phase of his plan, the Enabling Act. On March 23, 1933, the newly elected Reichstag met under tight security in Berlin's Kroll Opera House. The Enabling Act would give Hitler the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval, effectively ending democratic rule. To pass it, he needed a two-thirds majority. The Communists had already been arrested. The Social Democrats opposed the bill, but they were outnumbered and intimidated. Most other parties, especially the Catholic Center Party, caved, hoping to preserve influence. Surrounded by SS guards, the Reichstag voted overwhelmingly in favor. With that vote, the Weimar Republic officially died, and Hitler became a dictator in all but name. In the months that followed, Germany underwent radical transformation. Trade unions were banned. Political parties were dissolved. Local governments were purged and brought under Nazi control. Books were burned, and universities purged of un-German influence. The Gestapo, or secret police, expanded rapidly, creating a climate of fear. In April, the regime passed its first anti-Jewish law, barring Jews from civil service jobs. It was the beginning of a long and brutal process of exclusion that would later become genocide. Hitler also moved to neutralize potential rivals. The Nazi SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had grown powerful and unruly. In June 1934, Hitler struck. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, he ordered the SS to assassinate Röhm and other political enemies, consolidating his control over the Nazi movement and winning favor with the army. Then, in August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Within hours, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer, leader of the German Reich and people. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty to him. In less than 7 months, Hitler had transformed a fragile democracy into a totalitarian state. Germany was no longer a republic. It was now a Nazi dictatorship. With President Hindenburg's death in August 1934, and the army's sworn oath of loyalty, Adolf Hitler stood unchallenged at the top of Germany's political hierarchy. He now carried the title of Führer, and the Nazi regime quickly began reshaping the state, not just in its laws and institutions, but in the daily lives, thoughts, and beliefs of its citizens. The transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state intensified. The Nazi Party was no longer one political faction among many, it became the state itself. Every local office, court, school, and cultural institution was gradually brought into line with Nazi ideology in a process known as Gleichschaltung, or coordination. The Gestapo, Germany's secret police, expanded rapidly. Operating above the law, it encouraged citizens to inform on one another. A careless joke or political opinion could lead to arrest. People learned to whisper or say nothing at all. Fear became a tool of governance. Propaganda played a central role in this new order. Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, oversaw a vast machine of newspapers, films, posters, and radio broadcasts, all spreading Nazi ideology. The press no longer reported the news, it repeated party doctrine. Radios were sold cheaply to ensure every German household could hear the Führer's voice. The Nazi regime understood that control of thought was as important as control of force. At the center of this messaging was the myth of a reborn Germany. The Nazis promised to erase the shame of Versailles, rebuild national pride, and create a racially pure people. The slogan, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, was everywhere. Public rallies, parades, and youth marches gave the appearance of unity and strength. Nowhere was indoctrination more aggressive than among the youth. The Hitler Youth and its counterpart for girls, the League of German Girls, replaced independent youth organizations. Children were taught to revere Hitler, embrace racial ideology, and prepare for war. Education shifted sharply. Textbooks were rewritten, teachers replaced or monitored, and classrooms turned into ideological training grounds. The Nazi regime also expanded its attack on Germany's Jewish population. Jews were expelled from civil service, medicine, law, journalism, and education. In 1935, the government passed the Nuremberg Laws, which defined Jews racially, stripped them of citizenship, and forbade intermarriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. Jewish businesses were boycotted, and anti-Semitic rhetoric filled newspapers and public signage. The legal groundwork for persecution was now firmly in place. Meanwhile, Hitler began reviving Germany's economy, or appearing to. Massive public works projects, such as the construction of the Autobahn highway system, reduced unemployment. The regime invested heavily in rearmament, creating jobs in the arms industry and signaling Germany's return to military power. Though official statistics were manipulated, many Germans felt the economy improving and credited Hitler. In foreign policy, Hitler moved cautiously but deliberately. In 1935, he announced that Germany would reintroduce conscription, violating the Treaty of Versailles. The Western powers protested, but took no real action. A year later, in 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, sending German troops into a demilitarized zone bordering France. Again, Britain and France hesitated. Hitler's gamble paid off. His popularity soared. Internally, dissent was crushed. Political opposition no longer existed. Concentration camps like Dachau were already in use, housing communists, socialists, unionists, and anyone deemed an enemy of the state. While these camps were not yet centers of mass extermination, they served as a brutal warning of what happened to those who resisted. By the end of 1936, the Third Reich was a fully consolidated dictatorship. Through terror, propaganda, economic revival, and nationalistic pride, Hitler had captured the hearts of millions, and silenced those who opposed him. Germany was no longer recovering from war. It was preparing for the next one. By 1936, Adolf Hitler had turned Germany into a one-party dictatorship, infused with militarism, racial ideology, and a cult of personality. But the Nazi regime was not satisfied with transforming Germany from within. The next step, long planned and openly discussed in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, was to reshape the map of Europe. The same year Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, Hitler also forged a new alliance, the Rome-Berlin Axis, linking Nazi Germany with Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini. Their shared interest in authoritarian rule, expansionism, and hostility to communism laid the foundation for a dangerous new partnership. By 1937, Japan would also draw closer to the Axis through the Anti-Comintern Pact, aimed at countering Soviet influence. But while foreign relations evolved, Hitler kept pushing his domestic vision of a racially pure Germany. The Nuremberg Laws continued to strip Jewish citizens of rights. Jewish-owned businesses were boycotted or forcibly sold. Jews were banned from most public spaces and professions. Anti-Semitism moved from hateful rhetoric to institutional policy, with clear long-term goals: segregation, removal, and eventually elimination. The Nazi economy, meanwhile, was increasingly focused on war preparation. The four-year plan, overseen by Hermann Göring, aimed to make Germany self-sufficient and ready for large-scale conflict. Factories churned out tanks, planes, and ammunition. The military expanded rapidly, and new technologies were developed in secret. To the outside world, Hitler maintained a mask of diplomacy. He assured foreign leaders that Germany only wanted peace and fairness. In reality, the regime was already planning its first territorial move, Austria. In March 1938, Hitler initiated the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. Austrian Nazis had been agitating for unification for years, and Hitler, himself Austrian by birth, used unrest as a pretext. German troops crossed the border on March 12, meeting no resistance. Crowds cheered in Vienna. Days later, a referendum, orchestrated by the Nazis, claimed that over 99% of Austrians supported the Union. The Anschluss was a major violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. But again, Britain and France, still reeling from World War I, took no action. Their policy of appeasement, led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, rested on the belief that satisfying Hitler's demands would preserve peace. Emboldened, Hitler turned next to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a border region with a large ethnic German population. Hitler claimed that Germans there were being oppressed, a fabricated justification. He whipped up nationalist fervor, declaring that Germany would not tolerate abuse of its people. In September 1938, tensions escalated to the brink of war. But rather than confront Hitler, Britain and France negotiated. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed by Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, but not Czechoslovakia. The deal allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further demands. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." Hitler had achieved his goal without firing a shot. German forces moved into the Sudetenland in October, greeted with a mixture of enthusiasm and fear. Czechoslovakia was left weakened and humiliated, its defenses compromised. To the German people, these territorial gains were proof of Hitler's strength and vision. He had restored Germany's borders, defied the victors of World War I, and faced down the Western powers. His popularity soared. Opposition had long been silenced. Now, nearly the entire country stood behind him. But Hitler's ambitions didn't end at reclaiming lost lands. He was preparing Germany, psychologically, economically, and militarily, for something far larger. War was no longer a distant threat. It was the next step in the Nazi plan. Following the Munich Agreement of 1938 and the peaceful annexation of the Sudetenland, Adolf Hitler was at the peak of his power. He had outmaneuvered Britain and France, expanded Germany's territory without war, and further humiliated the weakened democratic nations of Europe. At home, the public hailed him as a genius statesman. But beneath the celebration was a darker truth. Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, just 6 months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler broke his promise. He sent German troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia, occupying Prague and establishing control over the Czech lands. It was no longer about uniting ethnic Germans, it was naked military expansion. For the first time, Hitler had seized territory that was clearly not German in language, culture, or history. The West had no more illusions. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, burned by Hitler's deceit, finally abandoned appeasement. Britain and France issued a guarantee to Poland, promising to defend it if Germany invaded. The clock toward war began ticking. Meanwhile, Hitler turned inward again, tightening control over German society. Persecution of Jews intensified. In November 1938, the Nazi regime launched a nationwide attack on Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes in what became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered, over 1,000 synagogues were burned, and tens of thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Kristallnacht was a turning point. It exposed the depths of Nazi brutality, and made clear that violence against Jews was now state policy. While many Germans were shocked by the scale of destruction, few spoke out. The Nazi grip on media, law enforcement, and education ensured silence. In foreign policy, Hitler's attention shifted to Poland. He demanded the return of Danzig, a free city under League of Nations protection, and proposed a corridor connecting East Prussia to the rest of Germany. Poland refused, backed now by British and French guarantees. Hitler faced a dilemma. He wanted war, but not a two-front war, like in World War I. So, in a stunning move, Hitler struck a deal with his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. The world was shocked. Fascism and communism were supposed to be mortal enemies. But the pact included a secret protocol. The two powers would divide Eastern Europe between them, including Poland. Now assured that the Soviet Union would not interfere, Hitler prepared for war. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west, using a new, terrifying military strategy, blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, planes, and motorized infantry overwhelmed Polish defenses in days. On September 17, Soviet forces invaded from the east, and Poland was crushed. Within weeks, the country was divided between the two totalitarian powers. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. World War II had begun. In Germany, war fever took hold. Hitler's speeches whipped up national pride. Propaganda painted Germany as the victim, forced into action by Polish aggression and British betrayal. Dissent was non-existent. The Gestapo watched everything. Young men were drafted. Jews were further segregated. Concentration camps expanded. Political prisoners disappeared. Hitler's power, already vast, grew even greater in wartime. Every resource, industrial, social, and psychological, was now directed toward the war effort and the Nazi vision of a new, racially pure, European order. The transformation that began in 1918 was complete. Germany, once a defeated empire, had become a militarized dictatorship with global ambitions. The world would now pay the price for ignoring the warning signs. With the outbreak of World War II, Adolf Hitler's vision for a Nazi-dominated Europe entered its most violent phase. Germany's invasion of Poland marked the first step in a war that would kill tens of millions and engulf the globe. For the Nazi regime, war wasn't just about conquest, it was about fulfilling their twisted ideology of racial hierarchy, living space, and elimination of the unfit. After crushing Poland, Germany turned west. In 1940, Nazi forces invaded and rapidly conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Hitler's army seemed unstoppable. Britain stood alone. Though the Nazis launched the Blitz, a prolonged bombing campaign, on London and other cities, the British, under Winston Churchill, refused to surrender. Germany's victories emboldened Hitler. Behind the scenes, the Nazi regime was already implementing the next phase of its racial agenda: the genocide of Europe's Jews. In occupied Poland, the Nazis established ghettos, forcing Jews into overcrowded, walled-off sections of cities. Conditions were horrific: starvation, disease, and violence were rampant. But this was only a temporary measure. Nazi leaders were debating something even more monstrous: the complete extermination of the Jewish people. At the same time, the Nazi regime intensified its control over the German population. All opposition had long been eliminated. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, operated an expanding network of concentration camps, where political dissidents, Roma, homosexuals, and others deemed undesirable, were imprisoned, tortured, and often worked to death. The German public, now living under constant propaganda, rationing, and militarization, saw only what the regime wanted them to see. Films, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and schools reinforced Nazi ideology. Even in wartime, Hitler remained a near mythical figure to many, a savior who had restored pride and order. In 1941, Hitler made his most fateful decision yet: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June, was the largest military invasion in history. It was a war of annihilation, not just against the Soviet state, but against Slavic people, communists, and Jews, all labeled as enemies of the Nazi race-based order. German troops advanced rapidly at first, capturing vast territories. But they also committed unspeakable atrocities. Special units called Einsatzgruppen followed the army, rounding up and murdering Jews, intellectuals, and political leaders. Entire villages were massacred. In Babi Yar, near Kiev, more than 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days. Back in Germany, planning for what the Nazis called the final solution was underway. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference to formalize their genocidal plan. The goal: the systematic extermination of Europe's Jewish population, totaling over 11 million people. The means: death camps. Facilities like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were built or expanded for one purpose: mass murder. Gas chambers, crematoria, and train systems were designed with chilling efficiency. The industrialized killing of millions would begin in earnest. Meanwhile, Germany's war machine continued its push into Soviet territory. But by late 1942, the tides were beginning to turn. The brutal Russian winter, fierce Soviet resistance, and the overextension of German supply lines began to stall the Wehrmacht. In North Africa, German forces under Erwin Rommel faced growing Allied resistance. Still, inside Germany, Hitler maintained total control. The Gestapo monitored civilian life. Dissent was met with arrest or death. German children continued to be indoctrinated in Nazi schools. The war, once a path to glory, was becoming a path to madness, but the Nazi grip on power only tightened. What had begun as a fringe movement in the 1920s was now a global engine of destruction, reshaping borders, toppling nations, and exterminating entire populations. The Nazi regime had reached its peak. But cracks were forming, and the downfall was approaching. By early 1943, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The turning point came at Stalingrad, where Hitler's armies were halted, encircled, and forced to surrender. It was a crushing defeat, the first major collapse of the German military, and a psychological blow to Hitler's image of invincibility. More defeats followed. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was driven back by Allied forces. In the West, Britain and the United States launched relentless bombing campaigns against German cities. Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to rubble. Civilians huddled in basements while firestorms raged above them. Yet even as the war effort unraveled, the Nazi regime continued its grip over the German people. Propaganda grew more desperate, depicting Germany as a fortress surrounded by enemies. Total war was declared. Every man, woman, and child was expected to serve the cause. Inside the death camps, the extermination continued at full scale. At Auschwitz, thousands were murdered daily in gas chambers. The Nazi regime diverted trains from military supply lines to transport Jews, Roma, and others to the camps. Even as the front lines closed in, the killing went on. But the cost of war was catching up with Hitler. Supplies were dwindling. German cities were bombed day and night. Soldiers were dying by the hundreds of thousands. Morale dropped. Still, opposition was nearly impossible. The Gestapo and SS hunted down any sign of resistance. Those who dared to speak out were executed or sent to the camps. In July 1944, a group of German army officers attempted to assassinate Hitler in the July 20th plot. They planted a bomb in his briefing room, hoping to kill him and seize control. Hitler survived, injured but alive. The conspirators were caught, tortured, and executed. The failed plot only increased his paranoia and tightened his grip on power. But the war could not be saved. In the east, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing through Poland, the Baltics, and into Germany itself. In the west, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opened a new front. By the end of the year, Allied forces had liberated France and were advancing toward the German heartland. In early 1945, Hitler refused to surrender. He still believed in final victory, even as Germany was collapsing around him. Berlin was surrounded by Soviet troops. Nazi officials fled or took their own lives. Civilians suffered horribly in the final battles. A nation destroyed by the very regime that had promised greatness. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin, alongside his partner, Eva Braun. He left behind a shattered country, a devastated continent, and the legacy of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The Third Reich, which Hitler once claimed would last 1,000 years, had lasted only 12. What followed was reckoning. The world discovered the full extent of Nazi crimes: mass graves, concentration camps, death factories. Survivors told stories that shocked humanity. The Nuremberg trials were held to bring Nazi leaders to justice. Some were sentenced to death. Others were imprisoned. The ideology that had once infected an entire nation was exposed, condemned, and outlawed. The Germany that had embraced Hitler was no more. In its place rose a new republic, divided, devastated, but determined never to forget. Across Europe and the world, the memory of what had happened, and how it had happened, became a warning. A warning about fear. A warning about propaganda. A warning about silence. The rise of Nazi Germany was not inevitable. It was a choice, built slowly through crisis, hatred, and the abandonment of democracy. And history ensures we remember what that choice cost.